And you are listening to Cowork Radio with Catherine Raymock and Jane Walker-Wood. We're a show for the modern entrepreneur and featuring company founders. We are absolutely thrilled to have in the studio with us Angel Martinez. He is the former president and CEO of Deckers. He's now an independent consultant, also running for mayor of Santa Barbara, served on numerous boards. And I think first, many people know you from the work that you've done with Deckers primarily, but you had shoe experience before that. So first of all, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you, Catherine.
Welcome.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jane.
So for folks that don't know your background, it's very interesting. We're going to talk about this. I have questions for you about immigrant entrepreneurs who outnumber, in terms of percentages, others and what that is about it. But for you, it very much was tied to you being an immigrant and coming to this country, right?
It was. I think one of the things I learned early on was that America is a place where opportunity abounds. And it was drilled in my head when I was a really little kid that you should take advantage of every opportunity America offers and make the best of these opportunities. And it became something that I really took to heart, so from having multiple paper routes to, having my first store to all these entrepreneurial things I used to do. It was something I lived for.
Hey, Angel. I'm actually Jane Walker-Wood, and I'm also an immigrant. I came here from Canada. And I also came here because there was so much opportunity. Now, I love your story about college and how you were a runner, and then you end up with shoes. How did that work? Yeah,
this is, when I was a kid in high school, I was initially a very terrible runner, and as time went on, I got better and better at it. But I had a lot of injuries as a runner, so I started to make the connection between the really lousy running shoes I was wearing. Back in those days, we really didn't have something that you today call a running shoe. And there was a connection between those shoes and the injuries I was getting. So I started dabbling with shoes. I had a friend who could really make any kind of shoe I wanted from scraps and pieces of other shoes. And I made some, what I felt for me were great shoes. I started to understand that you could actually improve your performance and not get hurt, which by extension improves your performance. And it led me to this passion for footwear.
So are you saying your first shoes, you were running with homemade shoes glued together, sewed together?
Yeah.
Do you still have those?
No, I wish I did. No, I had a friend. We would take, an Adidas upper, and in those days, those shoes were rock hard.
Okay.
They were really uncomfortable. So he'd take the bottom off and take a midsole from a different shoe and an outsole from another shoe and cobble together a new shoe, which was actually better than anything Adidas was making at the time.
Can you imagine back then knowing that today there would be a 3D printer that you could make a prototype of that shoe on that you have out at Deckers now, right?
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
So at the time, did you think of yourself as an entrepreneur? Were you thinking, wow, this is what I want to do with my life? Or were you still thinking I'm eventually going to go the more traditional route?
I didn't even know what the word entrepreneur meant. I just wanted to make a living from my passion. Like any kid. If you love baseball, as a kid, you want to be a baseball player. So I couldn't be a baseball player. I was too small, couldn't throw the ball out of the infield. So running was something that I could do and was able to do pretty well. And then I knew these guys who had started this company called Blue Ribbon Sports up in Beaverton, Oregon, later known as Nike. And I kept thinking, well, if they can do it, I can do it. I can get in this running shoe business. So after college, I decided that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to open a running shoe store.
So at that point, you could actually buy the product.
At that point, you could buy running shoes. There were a few. There was Adidas and Nike had just started. And there was Tiger, which is today ASICS. Those were the three primary brands. New Balance was starting up, pretty early in game. And those were the brands. That's all there was. And so you went from experimenting with one shoe to another shoe. And that kind of led me to Reebok.
How do you, set the brands apart? Because I know our audience wants to know, and you're a branding expert. How do you get your brand to stand out? Because there's thousands of running shoes out there now.
Yeah, there are. And back in those days, it was really simply about offering a more cushioned ride. Because what was different about American distance running was that we ran on pavement. In Europe, primarily, particularly Germany, where Adidas made shoes, The reason their shoes were so hard is because their runners were running on grass and dirt.
Oh, that's fascinating.
And so American shoe companies sort of invented the idea of a well-cushioned midsole. And then it started to diversify into, well, do you run on trails or do you run on the road? And then over time, are you injury prone? Do you pronate, which is when your sort of feet tilt inward? Or do you have a neutral sort of foot strike? And all these things sort of created differences between the brands.
I'm interested when you say branding, and I think I read at one point that Nike actually paid an intern something like $25 to come up with the swoosh. Maybe they got more after that. But branding versus quality of product. So you've got branding. You're a Nike, you're UGG, whatever you happen to be. But if your quality of product isn't there, you obviously aren't going to make it over the long term. But that branding is very important too. So how do you balance that?
Yeah, branding. So you have to think of it this way. I mean, branding is not. Everyone claims to be a brand builder, but what you see mostly are labels. Labels are not brands. Brands are sustainable. Brands are things because of their inherent value. You know, the value added, the thing that people can depend on. People come back to brands over and over again. A label is something that you buy because it's cheaper than the other thing, or it's something that meets a very short-term need for, let's say, fashion. There's millions of fashion labels that I would not call brands. They're just labels. And so that's what's different about a brand. You have an obligation when you have a brand to sustain for the long term what it is that people find valuable about the brand. And it's shocking to me how many people don't actually know, if they have a brand, what's valuable about their brand. They don't bother to do the investigation to understand from consumers, why do you like this brand? What is it about this brand that appeals to you? What is it about this brand that would make you want to come back and experience it again?
Now, how would you recommend they do that better? If I've got a new item I'm trying to sell, how do I get that?
Well,
Facebook and
brands.
internet.
Yeah, brands today. The other thing to understand about brands is they evolve over time. So when you first start, you have a brand. You think you have a brand, but no one else knows that yet. So you might be the only one that knows you have a brand, right? It depends on your sort of perspective and the longevity you may expect. So you then, if you have an assumption you want to have a long-standing brand, you have to build permanence in it from the product creation forward. You know, the very first product has to be unique. And once you start doing that, then you can survey consumers and validate whether or not what you thought was unique is actually unique. What you thought is valuable is actually valuable. And a brand can always attain a higher price because it's supposed to be delivering a higher value. That's why today you see the world is sort of bifurcating into commodity products and brands. And the reason is that brands invest a lot of money in R&D and product development and that quality sort of standard moving forward through generations of product. And commodities don't do that. You know, they just want to sell you some stuff right now, and they're not thinking too much about, you know, what it is they want to do 5 years from now.
When you initially went to Deckers, did you have an idea about the growth potential at that point? And what was the progression of that like for you as the company began to build and build?
Yeah, I really thought Deckers was a very undeveloped platform, if you will, because of the quality of the brands it had at the time. It had Teva, it still does. There was another brand called Simple, which actually was quite groundbreaking in its day. It was the first footwear brand to use environmentally sustainable materials in the production of footwear. Broke ground in production
like
worldwide.
What kind of materials?
Well, for example, we were using cork, natural latex. We were using gum rubber. We were using cotton blends and various things like that were not only in manufacture not dependent on oil products, but also in the way they were put together were environmentally sustainable.
Now, does that make a better product, or did that help you stand out to people who are environmentally conscious who probably are also runners?
Yeah, it wasn't a running shoe. It was more of a casual shoe. But in many cases, it did make a better product. But more importantly, it helped us say something about ourselves that no one could say about
to make yourself unique
right.
as your branding.
It was important from a marketing point of view, and it was also important from a product point of view. And then we had UGG. And UGG was what I felt was the most undeveloped brand in the footwear industry. I'm sort of a believer in this idea that products that stand out have to be, to some extent, controversial. I would almost say, products that do well initially, you have to have a plus or minus reaction to. You can't be neutral about them. So people at that time felt that UGG was weird.
Does it stand for ugly?
No, it does not.
My favorite pair of shoes are my UGG. Every morning I put on my UGG slippers. I take the dogs outside.
But that is such an interesting point because, I mean, honestly, I was seeing a guy at that time, I think it was 20 years ago, and he was the first person that I ever saw wear UGG boots, and I thought, those are just weird. Yeah.
Well, you had an opinion one way or the other.
Oh, yeah.
So,
but standing out, yeah.
It's very important in the footwear industry because when you walk into a shoe store, everything looks the same, pretty much, especially if you step outside of the athletic realm. And so in order to actually have any possibility of selling product, the first thing that has to happen is you have to attract the hand. So it's got to be a visual diversification of product, okay? And so UGG definitely stands out. It is something unique. And then from there, once you pick it up, you move to a sort of tactile understanding. In other words, if it's soft, supposed to be soft, looks soft, I pick it up and it's hard, I'm putting it down. If it's supposed to be light and I pick it up and it's heavy, I'm putting it down. Okay? And if it's supposed to be flexible, I pick it up and it doesn't flex, I'm putting it down.
And warm. I love the warm of the Uggs.
And so UGG has an intrinsic sort of value that goes beyond its look. And those, to me, are the most successful opportunities for product. Teva was that in the very beginning.
One thing that the Deckers was very successful at, many different areas, but growing the business outside of the United States. Somebody that is American that has a business here, how do you suggest doing that? Do you have to be very well established here before you start to go overseas and into other markets?
That was definitely true back then. Now in the internet e-com era, that's not as true. I mean, you can have a breakthrough product in any corner of the world that takes off. If you have the just appropriate e-com distribution, you can do that. But back when we were really getting UGG going, what UGG had was something that was universally appealing. Okay, so this idea of luxurious comfort, this warmth idea, I haven't met a person in the world, particularly when it's a little chilly outside, who doesn't think that's a great idea.
Exactly. And I'm from Canada. We love our Uggs. I have a question about, because we were talking about e-commerce and technology, and when you started, there was no such thing as the computer or the iPhone. And a lot of companies, say Kodak, they've basically disappeared and haven't been able to survive, make the adjustment. How did you guys?
Well, it goes back to, again, the consumer. I'm a big product person. Product. The most important thing is like real estate, location. In marketing, it's product. Particularly now, when consumers are so discerning, and lowest price and best assortment are a click away. So you have to have something that actually does what it says it's going to do and does it better than everyone else. And without that, you're going to struggle. It's going to be very difficult. So in my mind, we always had a focus on product. Product was the most important thing. It had to deliver what we said it would deliver. Even back in Reebok days, we introduced garment leather to footwear. No one had ever done that before. Here were shoes that when you put them on felt like slippers. You may remember your very first pair of Reebok aerobic shoes.
Yes, I do.
And nothing felt like that until you put that on. You'd never experienced that in anything remotely related to an athletic shoe. And that was sort of the beginning of what made Reebok unique and different. And it's funny, but typically what happens is that the rest of the industry will resist. They will poo-poo the product.
They're the Kodaks.
Exactly. I remember when I was living in Boston at the time when digital photography first was introduced, and this is now the early 90s. And I had friends that worked for Polaroid. And they were in such denial that this thing called digital photography would ever obsolete instant photography. Well, what's more instant than digital photography? That's about as instant as you can get. And that company went down like a ship in the
rock,
night.
Yeah. A lot of them did when technology came.
Yeah.
If you're just tuning in, we're talking with Angel Martinez. He is the former president, CEO